We're going to get a little bit philosophical for a few minutes. The title of this presentation probably only just fits within the themes of the session and the themes of the conference, but I will be asking us to think about a bit of innovation with respect to the way we see our national economy being run. So is Australian economic growth good for Australia? I'm probably going to be wading out of my depth a little at times. I might attract criticism from some and bewilderment from many. I'll try and avoid value judgments, folksy belief sets, and I'll definitely try and avoid conspiracy theories. But strap yourself in, stay with me, because you'll be rewarded with the unveiling of a new economic theory. Economic growth. Economic growth is viewed as compulsory. Our quarterly GDP announcements and how much has it changed is a central theme to our life. It gets analysed endlessly. If it goes up a bit more, we're happy. If it doesn't go up quite enough, or heaven forbid, it doesn't go up at all, especially for a sustained period, we're doomed. We need it to sustain employment. We need it to sustain the asset price growth that we're all grown accustomed to, and it seems we probably need it to sustain stable government. But I would observe that over the years we seem to be having to exercise increasing effort to maintain rates of economic growth. The levers of fiscal policy, monetary policy and microeconomic reform that governments and large institutions are responsible, we seem to have to pull them harder and harder. Witness at the moment, we have persistent expansionary fiscal policy, persistent government deficits. We have the lowest interest rates for many, many years, much like many countries. Yet we have persistently sluggish economic growth rates, like many countries as well. Our economic foot is flat to the boards. What I'd like to do now is take a few minutes to consider the limitations of this approach and perhaps some of the downsides. I'd like to introduce you to Engels Law. Some of you have probably heard about Engels. Engels Law, it's named after Ernst Engels. Not Friedrich Engels, Karl Marx's friend, but Ernst Engels, who was a Prussian statistician. In 1857, he confirmed the observation that for a household, as income rises, the amount that gets spent on food rises, but then plateaus. There's only so much food most of us need. Americans more than others, but and hence, as a proportion of our household income, the amount spent on food declines. This can actually be, in fact, applied to any good, not just food, because for almost any good, there's only so much that you need. And it's the task of many corporations to try and defy that law with innovation and product marketing to get you to consume more, probably more than you really need. Engels' law has been true for many, many years, and it's still true today. This is from a 2011 publication looking right across the world, and it confirms what's been true for many, many years. As the GDP of a nation grows, the proportion that each household within that nation spends on food declines. There's some exceptions, but generally it still holds true. At low levels of income, the development set like to refer to it as workers' misery or vulnerability to poverty. If you've got to spend the vast bulk of your income on food, then you're not in a very stable position. But as there's less of a household's percentage income spent on food, a lesser proportion of the economy is represented in food production. So less of the relative economic opportunity is in food production. And in Australia, where rural and regional Australia is still primarily reliant on agriculture, that means with economic growth comes less relative economic opportunity in rural and regional Australia. Every increment of Australian economic growth drains rural and regional population away from the regions, and particularly young people. The primary driver of rural depopulation and rural demographic change is economic growth. Any other explanation is spin or just plain wrong. And we see this being played out now. Engels Law continues. The number of farmers continues to decline. The amount of farm employment continues to decline, and we're all aware of small regional centres declining, even disappearing, and large regional centres being static at best. With declining and ageing population comes declining access to infrastructure and services, declining social function, increasing pressure on mental health, reduced political power, which exacerbates all of the above issues, and I certainly believe a decreasing ability to husband the landscape if there's less and less people to do it. So we're trading the average rural population for increased average material wealth of the whole of Australia's population. I would suspect if we cast our minds back to the time of Federation, for much of that time, it's been a worthwhile deal. Economic growth has delivered much for every citizen. It's freed a whole proportion of the population from what I would call compulsory agriculture, remembering that at the time of Federation, a good 50% plus of the population was in agriculture. But I ask, is it still doing that? Is it still delivering? And how can we look at this deal? Look at what economic growth has delivered over time. And we will touch on the tenuous connection between economic growth and social progress. But to assess that, we need to move beyond GDP as a measure of progress onto concepts of quality of life and what is the good life. Now, considering the quality of life has a long heritage, beginning with Plato and Socrates in ancient Greece. Plato was the idealist, proposing a whole republic on ideal circumstances. Socrates was the pragmatist, all he believed was good red wine and olives and you've got the whole thing sorted. Most religious ideologies are based on the idea of the pursuit and retention of the good life. And a whole range of authors have tackled it over the years. Keynes, Herman E. Daly, John Kenneth Galbraith, recently in Australia, Clive Hamilton and Hugh Mackay. But I've chosen a framework developed by a Polish father and son academic team based in the UK, Skidelsky and Skidelsky, it sounds like a name for a rock and roll band, in their book How Much Is Enough. And in there they propose a framework, 7 elements for a good life: health, security, respect, friendship, personality, leisure, and harmony with nature. So we're going to step through those a little and see how we measure up. How does economic growth deliver for the whole of Australia on these grounds? With health, we've had huge gains since the time of Federation. And that's the time frame I'm generally going to choose. It's the time we've existed as a nation. At the time of Federation, the average life expectancy was 50 years old. Now, it's worth considering, as Isabel pointed out, not everyone in this room is within sight of 50 or gone past it, but it's a sobering thing to consider that in the space of 115 years, our life expectancy has gone up by 30 years. It's huge. In fact, the whole field of geriatrics, looking after old people, was non-existent in 1900. It's now a growing field for research and development, service provision, and investment. The very basic parameter of infant and child mortality. At the turn of the century in 1900, the death of both infants and mothers in the process of childbirth was a significant issue. Everybody knew people who came off families who had been affected by this. But over the period of the 20th century, particularly during the middle parts of the 20th century, it vanished as an issue. We don't really think about it much anymore. The birth process is not nearly as torturous as it used to be. That's a huge gain. But I would observe that was a gain that was had 60 years ago. Likewise, debilitating infectious diseases have been tackled and generally defeated. This photo is of a young girl, Rosalind Pickhaver, a young Australian girl, and she's one of the last Australians to have suffered from polio. The Salk vaccine was invented in 1956, the improved Sabin vaccine in 1966, and it meant that for Australians, polio is history. We don't even think about it. The same has been achieved along with antibiotics, with a combination of antibiotics and vaccination with tuberculosis, whooping cough, and a range of ailments, notwithstanding those who don't believe in the science of inoculation. But big gains have been had. But those big gains were mostly had by the 1970s. And a recent article in The Economist pointed out that increments of life expectancy we're adding now as our life expectancy goes up past 80 years are generally increments added to our decrepit lives, the costly and less fun part of our lives. And it's questionable whether longer lives past 80 as an average really help us much. And we've moved on to new problems. We're becoming increasingly obese and diabetic from a modern lifestyle. This figure shows the average rate of child obesity in Australia over the last 110 odd years. And it shows that up until about the 1970s, it was fairly stable. 8% of children were overweight. In 1985, it was 10%, 95, 20%. By 2005, it was 21 to 27% and rising. We've got increasing rates of some allergies, increasing rates of some cancers, increasing chronic stress levels. I would argue that for our health status, we reached a plateau, if not something of a peak, in about the 1970s, as a population in general. Personality. Now, I choose to frame personality as autonomy, or the ability to frame and execute life as you really want. And I've framed it in two ways. That's the change in your net worth and having stable governance all around you. Now, as Isabel has suggested, as a farming community, as Australia in general, our net worth has gone up. In 2003, the average household net worth was $585,000. In 2012, it was $728,000. Notwithstanding, most of that increase went to higher net worth households. The bottom 20% went nowhere. But along with that comes a flip side. The average house in Australia takes between 6 and 8 times the average income in Australia to buy, as opposed to 3 to 4 times the average income 20 years ago. That is a real, definite change in affordability. And as a result, Australian households are increasingly in debt. In 1990, the average mortgage was 10% of property value. Now it's 28% of property value, and that's a much higher property value, as we all know. So, yes, our net worth's gone up, but it's definitely been dented, if not cancelled out, by lesser affordability of some things that are important to us and an increasing amount of indebtedness. And yes, we are blessed with stable governance in this country, notwithstanding what happened a couple of days ago. But we stand alone in the world. The continuing length of democracy that we've had, it's something really to be valued, and perhaps economic growth's played a role in keeping that. But I would suggest that, particularly since the mid to late 20th century, I don't think the contribution of the personality part of our quality of life's really changed that much. Harmony with nature. Now, harmony with nature's probably decreased gradually as we've become an increasingly urbanised population, somewhat remote from nature. True, at the same time, the general awareness of at least basic ecological issues has improved, and hence you see the rise of gardening as an art form, along with cooking, which is a somewhat more human-centred appreciation of nature. Leisure. Leisure I've defined as purposeful activity without toil. And we have achieved quite a bit since 1900. In 1900, the average worker worked 60 to 80 hours a week. By the 1940s, the 40-hour week had been enshrined, And by 2011, the average worker was working 35 to 40 hours a week. That's the average worker. I'm not considering farming families. And that's been a huge gain. There's a lot more leisure time than there used to be for the average worker. But what's happened in the same time is it's now pretty normal for both partners in a household to work, which has reduced the amount of leisure time. True, it's made for more equality and more balanced workplaces, but it's made getting family life to work, particularly with young families, more challenging. Leisure is becoming more purposeful. There's a whole industries now revolving around making your leisure more time efficient, dare I say. But I do feel that the big gains in leisure have probably been had again. The big gains were probably in the first half of the 20th century. The amount of leisure we're achieving is probably pretty stable now. Friendship. With greater connectivity and greater mobility, I'm pretty sure our friendship has a broader reach. Many of us have many, many Facebook friends. But at the same time, I suspect our friendships are a little shallower than they used to be on average. The ability to have the time and context to meaningfully engage with friends on a deeper level is probably not as good as it would be. So I do suspect friendship is relatively static now, although the dynamics are changing. Respect. This one's a toughie. Now we're delving into the abstract quite a lot, but it's still very important. It's believing that others' views and actions are worthwhile. Adam Smith asserted that getting the respect of our peers is our most important goal in life. For this one, I think we are still improving markedly over a long, long period of time, witnessed by the greater tolerance of diversity that you're seeing in our society by most, be that diversity of religion, race, origin, gender preference, etc. It's probably driven by a greater awareness that's fostered by better communications that we have in our modern life. So I still think it's improving. Security. Security is the expectation that life will continue in an accustomed course. And there's a lot of overlap with previous themes, but the rate of change in our modern life in everything has increased over the decades, and it is favouring those who are accustomed to a course that expects change, as the Darwin quote of Isabel's showed. Governance, again, remains very stable by world standards, and we have much more of a social safety net than we did since the time of federation. The time of the post-war reconstruction period in the late 40s and 50s was a very special period. That's when all of the elements of our social safety net were installed, thanks to a rapidly increasing tax base. Under the guidance of Curtin, Chifley, Coombs and even Menzies, we got unemployment benefits, family support, more access to particularly higher levels of education and the pension. But I do feel that the safety net is eroding. The pension has generally been replaced by superannuation, which is good for some, not so good for others if your superannuation total is not so good, particularly because we're all living longer. I do suspect the amount of security in our quality of life peaked in about the 1970s again, particularly for the bottom 50% of people. Big gains have been had, but the big gains were had decades ago. So there you have it. There you have it, the 7 elements of the good life. Health, security, respect, friendship, personality, leisure, and harmony with nature. And my conclusion is that most of them are going sideways with the exception of respect, and some seem to be drifting downwards. That's my stab at it. I'd encourage you to don't just believe me, make up your own minds, given this sort of framework. But my judgment is that economic growth is delivering us little currently with respect to the good life. And the judgment is probably worse if we consider the bottom 50%, because the inequality worsens most of the parameters we've got to think about. So hence, we have the Economic Growth Project. And economic growth was really only discovered as a deliberate policy tool, a deliberate goal in the post-war period to achieve social ends. Again, in the post-war reconstruction period, the Australian government approached immigration more aggressively, adopted more aggressive fiscal management to achieve substantial social change in that period that was built on the back of economic growth in a very special period. John Maynard Keynes, probably the most visionary of economists even to this day, he envisaged growth as at most a single century exercise with a beginning, middle and an end. In his seminal paper, The Future for Our Grandchildren, produced in the 1930s, he, partially as a response to the Depression and the apparent attraction of communism, he outlined that he thought at most after a century of growth from the 1930s, we would have achieved the goals that we want. That being a lot of leisure time and a truly enriched lifestyle. John Kenneth Galbraith saw the same limits in the 1950s. He simultaneously rejoiced the opportunities he had by moving away from their farm in the Lakes area, Great Lakes area of the US, but worried about the society that he left behind. This was the 1950s. They both perceived the limitations of the model that was being followed. So how did we get to this situation where a relatively recently discovered tool has been so quickly accepted as something that's needed in perpetuity, with no reflection on its sustainability or any particular downsides? And this is where you get treated to my new economic theory, Leroys Law. Now, it has Darwinian origins, so Charles Darwin gets another mention. And it goes to the effect that with jobs and asset growth and other opportunities that come from economic growth, comes a greater proportion of the jobs, the economic opportunities and the asset values that are reliant on growth. Hence, if you take those positives as a given, there comes a need to sustain growth, to sustain those growth-dependent jobs and opportunities. So what was regarded as a bonus or a privilege is now regarded as a right. John Stuart Mills observed that if enough people share a vested interest, it becomes the public interest. So hence, economic growth is not evil, it's not a conspiracy, but it becomes something that the average punter, via Leroy's Law, needs. And along with that, as our material wealth increases, our value set and our expectations increases along with it as to what's treated as normal. Because how many of you people in this room right now are really, truly satisfied with instant coffee anymore? So perhaps it's time for a change. If you take one thing away today, I'd like you to take away the firm link between national economic growth and rural depopulation. Economic growth has drained rural population for some time, and I would argue it was a very good trade-off for many, many, many years. But I suspect it's not such a good trade-off now. We're still enjoying our longest boom, probably not for much longer, and economic growth has delivered much for Australia as a whole. But I do feel that it's delivering less and less, and it is accumulating downsides, particularly for the whole of Australia, particularly when you consider economic inequality that comes with economic growth. So economic growth is a mechanism for satisfying a socio-economic structure and expectations that we don't necessarily need to satisfy. It's a little bit like a large slab of beer that you sit down in front of. Just because the first two beers are exceedingly satisfying doesn't mean the last one will be just as satisfying. I'd like us to move beyond this simplistic and somewhat childish obsession with economic growth as a measure of progress, because in my view it ain't doing it anymore, and it is cruelling Australia in the process. Does this mean actively resisting economic growth and trying to create some sort of utopia that Plato would have been proud of? I don't think it does. What I think it means is we try a little less to achieve it. I've already observed that over time I think we've got to pull the levers of fiscal policy, monetary policy, microeconomic reform harder and harder to get growth. Right now there's a general call for another round of microeconomic reform. We need that to sustain growth in the face of reducing comparative advantage, in particular in the face of volatility. I'd put it that perhaps we need to pull the levers a little less. Focus on what we really need. It'll be likely benefit the average Australian, and it would definitely benefit rural Australia.